Okay, here we go. It's Sarah Burke here, and this is the Women in Media podcast. My guest today, I actually know her as Dada Jada, but her name is Jada Watson. She's an assistant professor of digital humanities in the School of Information Studies at the University of Ottawa. And she also coordinates digital humanities programming in the Faculty of Arts. She's taught in the School of Music, which is going to make a lot of sense once you hear what we talk about. And she is the coordinator for the Digital Humanities Program, and she has a ton of research that's really cool that we're going to talk about today. Welcome to the Women in Media podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I can't believe after all this time, I'm finally here.
It's so funny. When did we first have that conversation? It must have been like September 2022, I want to say.
Maybe. Yeah. I think, was it around the time that you were hosting a panel at CCMA?
The Country Music Awards.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Canadian Country Music Association helped us put together a panel for women in country music. And I first heard your name through Desiree Dorian.
Yeah. Yes.
Who is an Indigenous musician. She's fantastic. And she was like, if you've never heard of this person, you have to check out her research. She is amazing. So funny enough, you told me that there's like a Jada before Dada Jada.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to start there.
Yeah.
Tell me about your past life before all this research.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's also research, but I think the piece that doesn't come up because of what I do is that I have this whole background in classical music. So after high school, which, and I'll come back to high school with relation to what I do now, but after high school, I went and did a diploma in piano performance at Cambrian College in Sudbury, Ontario. And then I came to the University of Ottawa, where I knew I wanted to be a music historian. So my studies were musicology, and I had a particular love of Soviet Russian music. So yeah, my undergrad is an honors in music with a minor in Russian studies. And cool. I studied in Russia for a couple of months in the end of my degree. Wow. My master's was on Shostakovich's Fourth String Quartet. So I really, truly was like on this path to be a Soviet Russian music historian. And I don't even really know, like there's a bunch of things that happened at the same time, but I was in my master's and I was taking my very first popular music studies course. And it was around the time that the Chicks released Taking the Long Way. So in that course, I decided to focus on Not Ready to Make Nice. And my world just changed. It wasn't even that different than what I was doing on Soviet Russian music, because Shostakovich was very much a censored composer under Stalin. So I found myself like always thinking about those connections between like politics and censorship of music, and to be sort of living through it in real time was sort of wild to me. Not, of course, that the government censored the Chicks, but of course we know what happened. But I was seeing all these really interesting relationships. So I eventually
switched. Parallel.
Yeah. It's a so weird one to talk about, but that's really where I got my start. And that doesn't mean that I wasn't always invested in pop music, lifelong fan.
Of course.
Like my world revolved around music. But that's, I guess, where I thought I would be. And I always thought I'd be a Soviet music historian who dabbled in popular music, but I ended up flipping entirely.
So did you grow up in Ottawa?
No, I grew up
in Sudbury.
No, actually, I was born in Montreal, and I moved to Eastern Ontario in a very small town called Baynesville, about 25 minutes east of Cornwall, when I was 9. And so I lived there until I moved to Sudbury. And then I've been in Ottawa since 2003.
And that was when you started studying?
Yeah, that's when I started my undergrad, did my master's, left for a bit, came back, and I'm still here today.
I wonder if we crossed over in Ottawa at all. Did I mention to you that I went to Carleton for a hot
minute? No.
Yeah, I did. I dropped out, but I went to Carleton for journalism.
Oh, when were you here?
It would have been 2000. I want to say 2006.
Yeah, I would have been doing my master's then.
Interesting.
Yeah, 2006 to 8.
Okay. Yeah. So what was the moment you knew you needed to do something with music? Like, take me back to Jada as a kid.
Yeah, that's where we go back to high school, really. I mean, we go back much further. I was thinking about this morning as I walked my dog. Um, when music started, because I was listening to, I don't know if you listen to that podcast, 60 songs that
Oh,
explain
I
the
love that
90s.
podcast.
Yeah, which is
Yeah.
like, we're well beyond 60 songs, which I love. But I was
I know.
listening to the episode on Garth Brooks this morning,
Okay.
and I don't think Rob Harvilla is that much older than me, maybe 3 years. I'm trying to sort of position him
Yeah.
in relation
I
to
love
my
his
life.
writing so much. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh.
Yeah. But but as he was talking about the songs that he listened to in the car with his parents, I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is always really how I describe my like sort of obsession with radio, but that was me." And I was thinking about like being 9-year-old Jada who is like obsessed with Debbie Gibson and New Kids on the Block, and then later, well, not that much later, about the same time, I guess, like Whitney Houston, Janet Jackson, and then the two biggies for me were Winona, and Tracy
Ah,
Chapman. Those two albums, their debut albums, have such like a strong emotional pull for me because I remember family trips, listening to them in the car and wearing those tapes right out.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's still the ones that like I can listen to front to back and take me back to that moment in
Right.
time. So I would have been like 8 or 9 when they came out. Um, but that was sort of pivotal for me. And then I started playing musical instruments when I was 9. And although I didn't last long in piano lessons at first, it was radio and piano what I would do. Like, I don't know if you know that Miranda Lambert song Automatic, where she talks about
Yeah.
taping the countdown. Like, that was me. I was using my
Oh,
parents' tapes, taping over the edges and making mixtapes of the countdown, and
wow.
then using those tapes to teach myself how to play those songs on piano. So
Wow.
I don't remember a moment when music wasn't part of my life. I don't know that 9-year-old Jada could predict teaching it. I think
Yeah.
at that age, I didn't even envision making it. I really, I had first a dream of being a journalist.
Me
Um,
too. I feel
yeah.
that.
Yeah. So like it's kind of fun now when I get to dabble in it a bit because I feel like I'm living out my little girl dreams.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's wild to think that I haven't veered too far from from those visions because I still very much write about music every day.
So I, mentioned a lot of words describing what you do with the
Yeah.
University of Ottawa. But if
Yeah.
you had to like bring that down to like a simple few words, like what's the mission with Jada Watson?
Um, I don't know if I can. Well, I mean, as a professor, I have sort of three components to my job. First and foremost, I suppose we could say I'm a teacher. We suppose I am a teacher.
Yes. Yes, you are.
I have been teaching at the university since 2011. And so teaching is a significant component of my job. And I teach now only in the School of Information Studies, but I used to teach in information studies, digital humanities, and music. The other part, or not the other, another part is research. So
Mm-hmm.
that's, if we were to sort of divide it, we think 40% teaching, 40% research. And that's sort of the development and maintenance of my research program, which I call Song Data.
Yep.
And then the other little bit is administration. So, like everything from admissions to program evaluation, working with students, etc. So,
Okay. So that's like a pretty high level part of it where you get to kind of shape the way the programs look. Do I have
yeah,
that right?
yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm in my first term of teaching. I don't know if I told you.
You
I'm
did.
teaching podcasting at Western, and yeah, it's so wild. And the
Are you
students,
loving
like,
it?
I am loving it. The
Good.
students are really, they're pretty engaged and they care a lot about whatever the thing is that their podcast is about. Like, I just find that when I was that young, I didn't know what I cared about. So I'm
Yeah.
impressed by that. I'm
Yeah.
impressed by that.
Yeah. They know much earlier than we did.
Yeah, they're really engaged in like activism. And I was actually going to ask you next. Like,
Yeah.
there's usually a moment that sort of lights a fire where you're like, oh, I am not okay with this, and I need to do something about this. What was that moment for you that like kind of thrust you into this next phase?
Ooh, that's a great question. Um, I guess in part Tomatogate. Um, that thrusted me into what I'm doing.
We'll probably have to explain it a little bit for anyone who doesn't know.
Yeah, so Tomatogate is a fun reference that we use to refer to May 2015 when a radio consultant for country format radio indicated that women were the tomatoes of the salad. Basically, this whole interview was about scheduling, and he said, um, that he keeps songs by women to 13 to 15% of his playlists to maintain or improve station ratings. And he goes on to say in this interview that women are the tomatoes of his salad. I remember this moment like really well. I didn't even read the interview right away, but I remember because I was finishing my dissertation, which was on a Canadian country artist, and then I logged into Facebook one day and all of my friends had tomatoes as their profile pictures. And I was like, what did I miss? And then my dear friend Travis, who's like a longtime mentor, was like, oh, read this.
Right.
And even still, I don't know that I really even envisioned what I could do because, the connection between academia and activism isn't always a clear, especially when you're in music history. It's not necessarily a clear path. But over time, as I started to change my research program towards this data-driven work, and I met this phenomenal women's advocacy group online called Women of Music Action Network, I was able to see a path for sharing the results that I was finding, which was really alarming. And even still, I didn't imagine what that would look like. You don't go into a PhD thinking that you're going to do public facing work. Everything we do is public, but you don't really think about the implications of being on social media and publishing work publicly, but sort of specifically with the goal of hoping that it helps somebody. There's no course in that. So in a way, I'm glad I didn't know what would come, because I think I would have done it, but
you would have had a lot more fear.
yeah. I mean, I had no idea. Like, you don't know when you start to do this work that obviously this immediately opens you up to emails and DMs
Criticism.
and not even criticism, but just because it was actually like not necessarily of the work. It was kind of me as living.
There's always a human behind whatever the published piece is. For sure.
Yep.
That's hard. And a lot of women who have been on this podcast talk about this thing that we're talking about right now. But let me flip that script for you. When you first were published, maybe talk about one of your first things you published.
The very, very first thing that I published on this topic of gender representation in the industry was actually an academic article. And I'd shared it with Todd Cassidy, who I'd met. He leads the Song Suffragettes in Nashville. I cannot remember now how we met. Oh, I think Women in Music Action Network introduced us because I was hoping to interview him for something. So I shared my work with him, and he read it on an airplane and tweeted it. And that was like, nothing happened. It didn't go viral or anything, but a couple of people reached out. One in particular being a lawyer in California who works on telecommunications. And so that sort of led to this interest in me in trying to figure out how to get radio data, because by that point I was only really using charts. Charts are expensive but accessible in a way that, direct from radio data is a little more challenging to get your hands on. And so through that relationship, I started to realize that having actual radio airplay data would be helpful. And so that's sort of the first public piece I published was April 2019 was this report on gender representation on country format radio in the United States. And that piece has been cited pretty widely, but I think the part that sort of makes me most proud of it is that it landed in that lawyer's brief that she submitted to the FCC. The National Association of Broadcasters had submitted a proposal for sort of further deregulation, which, as we know, with deregulation and consolidated ownership, it leads to sort of the centralized ownership and programming model. And the problems that ensue for that are, further homogenization of a format. So I was just so grateful to know that, one, these results were useful, and that, they were alarming and completely disheartening, but to know that they could potentially influence policy was really something I never envisioned. And finally, 4 years later, she has results and they won. And so there will, at the moment, there will be no more there. The proposal for further deregulation was shot down in the spirit of maintaining as much as possible diversity and localism within American radio. So that really, that piece was sort of interesting, because on the one side, I had this really exciting thing going on with it being cited in this legal brief. But then on the other side, I was really experiencing for the first time what trolling meant.
Yeah.
It took me about a week to figure out how to shut one down to just focus on the good. But not just like the good, because it wasn't about praise. It was about furthering conversations and just accepting every invitation to speak about what this work could do. So that was, that piece is really, really special. And I could not have done it without the support of the advocacy group.
It's really interesting that it kind of all began in the States for you.
Yeah.
What about reaction and engagement with your research in Canada?
That's really interesting. I would say I almost don't know how to answer it, because it's almost confusing or complicated, not confusing.
That's okay. Yeah.
On the one hand, it allowed me to meet people that I now collaborate with. I think specifically of Bronwyn Parks, who leads Feisty Creative.
Bronwyn.
Yeah. So my dear friend at the University of Ottawa went to school with Bronwyn. I can't remember their connection, but they introduced me to Bronwyn, and we were Insta friends, and have just really had each other's back since that moment. But then at the same time, there were program directors here who didn't really appreciate what I was doing. And I would just
stop you for one sec.
Yeah.
What does that look like? Not appreciating what you're doing?
I almost don't know how to answer it still. Conversations which say, sure, but you're missing half the picture. And then sort of shutting it down.
Like a dismiss, yeah.
Yeah, a dismissal. Okay, you're not wrong, the stats are bad, but no, you're missing this thing. And I'm like, well, okay, but can we talk about, there are ways in which this can change so that this thing can also change. And the thing is always, labels don't support enough women as well. That labels are the problem, and radio is just doing its best within this flawed system, right? The chicken and the egg, which comes first? Well, somebody has to be willing to step back and stop pointing the finger and make change.
Right.
There was also an event I was supposed to be part of early on. I think it was September 2019, that my understanding is somebody in Canadian radio didn't want me to be part of, and stopped that from happening.
We love a gatekeeper, don't we? God, makes me angry.
I mean,
can you say what conference it was at? Was it at a conference, or was it at just a one-off?
It was a one-off.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll leave it there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm not shocked. And, the fact that your research has been covered in so many places internationally now, hopefully that person can get over themselves. That's what I'm thinking about right now.
I,
Oh,
you know, it's fine. I understand.
yeah.
At the same time, I understand it. So interestingly, I understand it. I guess I understand it would be the nicest way to say that. A couple of weeks ago, I presented at Country Radio Seminar.
Oh, I
Um,
was going to ask you about that.
oh
Yeah, let's get in.
yeah,
Let's get into that.
yeah.
Yes.
It was really wonderful. I was completely surprised to be asked, but of course, it was at the invitation of Brian Webb, who works for Apple Country Radio. He produces Kelly Bannon's show,
Okay.
and he's on the program committee. And he and Kathleen Shea, who's with Sirius, had designed a couple of panels that were really aimed at um, reality. to
Yeah, pulling
talking
back the
about
layers.
to talking about what it looks like, what representation actually looks like, the sort of informal rules that govern practice at radio and how they just need to be broken. So
Hmm.
one panel was the one that Kathleen had curated, which had Holly G of the Black Opry and Rachel Kolst of Rainbow Rodeo, and they spoke in conversation with Johnny Chang, who's now at Sirius, about these myths of like not playing women back to back, not playing Black artists back to back,
Yeah.
and how they actually harm your potential for creating an audience, right? Like the individuals that they are playing so sparingly, these tomatoes in this salad, queer artists or artists of color. Well, if you're not playing them, then audiences who are
Don't
members
get
of those
to.
communities don't want to listen because they don't hear or see themselves reflected in that format. So it's such a strange business model because they're actually like shooting themselves at the foot for being an even bigger format, being a more inclusive format,
Yeah.
being
And the
a form.
familiarity,
Yeah,
right?
well,
Like
that too.
that was
Yeah,
something I read in some of your research. And with the familiarity, it's like, when even if you limit where it's playing in the daytime, like
yeah,
in radio programming, which, for those listening who don't know or haven't gone back in my catalog, I've done a lot of music programming over the last
yeah,
15 years. And it would be like, oh, we'll add that in the evening. Yeah, we'll put that in evenings only and things like
yeah,
that when you're not sure about something.
yeah.
So it was interesting to hear about that because, like, the model again is the more you hear it, the more familiarity, the more the audience grows to like it.
Right. I think it's really interesting that I think everyone who works in radio understands that they make something a hit. Like a hit isn't organic and naturally born. You have to play it a lot to make it a hit.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because that's precisely the language that was used at this panel and the panel I was on. And then it's like, okay, so you understand that you do that because you're putting the spins behind it. Now, why can't you see that you can do that with all of these other artists? We don't, a song doesn't come out in the world. You don't instantly like it. You like it because you become familiar with it. You on repeated listens, the
Yeah.
every time the music sits differently, the lyrics hit differently. And that is a huge part of the process. It doesn't mean, I should say there's going to be some music that you hear on first, like Texas Hold'em. I heard that. I was like, yes,
Oh,
yes.
yeah. I was gonna say, oh, there's one song I think was actually born a hit.
Yeah.
This is in recent
There,
memory.
there are always songs that are born hits, but then there are hits that are made.
Of course, of course.
Um, yeah.
So you actually mentioned when you were talking to me that your plan for this panel sort of pivoted as soon as Texas Hold'em came out. Tell me about that.
Yeah. Yeah. So our panel, which had Jess Wright of Live One and Travis Moon, who's at KKBQ in Houston, we were pulled together to speak about it's called diversity, spilling the data. And so
T as in TEA.
TEA, yeah.
Love it.
So I was brought in to give sort of a like 5-minute presentation on the state of representation within the format,
Oh boy.
which is nerve-wracking.
Yeah.
But it was a lot of fun. And so we, in our prep up to the panel, we had our last panel call the Tuesday after Texas Hold'em was released. And so on the one hand, you have this giant media swirl saying country radio is slow to embrace it. And this, is country radio refuses because of that one Oklahoma station. And I'm sitting here on this panel with two program directors, one terrestrial, one digital radio, and both are saying, oh no, we're adding it. Of course we're adding it.
So this fellow, Justin, had written into, I guess, or called his radio station, his local station. Yeah. So he ended up tweeting this out after this happened. I requested Texas Hold'em at my local country station, KYKC, and after requesting, I received this email from the radio station stating, we do not play Beyoncé because we are a country music station. Hi, like that simple. We do not play this as we are a country station. Thank you. Yeah. Like that's all that the email said. Yeah. And so that was, day after the Super Bowl, right?
Yeah. Tuesday, 2 days later, Tuesday.
Okay. And then you're having this meeting. So now continue on with your story.
Yeah. So it was interesting because I saw that tweet, and of course, the language was problematic. We started to find out later in the day that, in fact, the person who programs that station didn't watch the Super Bowl, didn't know, apparently, that Beyonce. So if we are to believe all the things that have been said about that moment, there was.
I don't know how you don't know.
I mean, I don't know either, but
I didn't watch the Super Bowl.
I did, and I knew the songs came out. So
yeah.
So there was that, but at the same time, there were many stations who were picking it up. And so we're in this panel. The other piece is that she hadn't serviced it to country radio yet. It had been serviced to every format but country on Monday. And at some point on Tuesday, it was serviced to country format radio.
That's an interesting strategy.
Yeah, really interesting, because in that 24 hours, the narrative immediately became country radio is refusing to play it, and they're slow to embrace it. And, questioning if they will. I'm like, wow, we're not even going to give anyone a chance, right? Like,
yeah,
we don't actually know what they're doing. And then, so all of this is happening. We're in our panel prep meeting, and it was our panelists plus folks from CRS. And they're like, well, obviously we're going to talk about this on the panel. This is fantastic. Yeah. And everyone's adding it. And they're all saying exactly like, it's already in rotate. It's already in schedule to be in our next day part, et cetera. Yeah. And so, and then by the end of the week, it had amassed like 600 spins, which is like what takes any other single 10 weeks to get to that point. So it was really aggravating. I am not an insider at all. I am not privy to these things, but I have access to a dashboard where I can watch data 24 hours a day. Yeah. And so it was really interesting to feel this disconnect between watching a format add it and play it in the daytime. Like, they're not adding it to evenings and overnights. They were playing it 43% during the day. And this like social media narrative that country format radio is rejecting it. And it's not perfect. Like, the whole situation is still so very messy because, they're playing Beyonce, but they're still not playing Black women who are country artists. And I'm not saying that in a way to suggest that Beyonce is not. I think country has been a very big part of her being since day one, but she had built this career outside of it. And now she's releasing this epic country music. They should be playing it, but they should also be playing Mickey Guyton, Reese Palmer, Miko Marks, Madeline Edwards, Brittany Spencer, on and on and on. There are so many Black women who are making exceptional music, and they're just not playing it. So it was interesting because we're in this panel, we're talking about what they're going to do, and then the panel happens a week and a half later. So I end up having 2 weeks worth of data to add into this. I didn't talk about it on the panel, but I added it in with my slides so that anyone who was interested could see what actually was happening. But the larger conversation still remains, she's already a global icon with millions of fans around the world. And absolutely they should be playing her. But how is that going to influence and impact in either way the career trajectories of Black women in country?
It's so funny at the gym this morning, the song comes on, people start going, oh, yes, like everyone's excited.
Yeah.
And the gal that I was working out with beside was like, money grab. I heard her say that out loud. And I was just like, and I also feel conflicted. Like you can see all the different perspectives surrounding this. And, I don't know if I would use the words money grab, but you can see why like taking up that space with Beyonce's hit might actually take away from some
Yeah.
other voices, right? That's what we're
Yeah.
looking at here.
Yeah.
It's not that she's not iconic and that the song isn't great, but
Yeah.
it's about thinking about those other voices. So,
Yeah.
yeah, where did the panel arrive on that?
Oh gosh. It was still a really great conversation too live at the event.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
both are playing it, It's interesting because Jess Wright station is a digital station. So it is quasi streaming, quasi programming. And so she's responding to likes and bands. And she said it's both in the first week and a half that it was in her rotation, it was the most liked and the most banned. So it's really a divisive song because it's divisive because the format has sort of created a culture in which, of course, it's divisive, right? Like they don't program songs by Black women. They did not play daddy lessons. The whole industry of country music, or I should say, Nashville Incorporated, has a real problem with Beyonce, and they historically have. So it makes sense that an audience who is still heavily reliant on radio is responding in a particular way, either love or completely hate, because they've been trained to believe that that's not possible, that she can't come in, that she doesn't, that it is just like pop music with a cowboy hat. The language around it is really, really racist, really sexist, really problematic.
Yeah. What is something, surprising that came out of this that maybe like all the stuff we've sort of touched on, you've seen in the headlines about this song, you've seen in many articles. Maybe what's something that struck you as someone who deals with data all day, that maybe we haven't been thinking about?
With Beyonce specifically?
Yeah, was there any interesting findings that maybe aren't like publicly available?
Nothing yet that's not publicly available, but the piece that I'm using to keep hopeful is that because I definitely have sides that make me upset, but the piece that I'm hopeful about is the way in which it has brought new people, new listeners to specifically Black women in country and the Black Opry, because they've had more followers. These artists, their streaming has spiked. Now, it could be Beyonce's influence. It could also be the long tail of the fact that it was Black History Month when the song was released. And so in general, those artists were getting more attention as a result of activities they were doing. Some were like doing Instagram takeovers. So like, it's not just one thing. There were a bunch of things, more concerts, more takeovers, more activity that was pushing folks to their channels.
Right. Yeah.
But Beyonce, I think that did cause a spike in the digital sphere. So now I'd like to see that translate elsewhere. To money.
To money. Let's get them paid, please. Yes. Yeah. It's Sarah Burke here, the host of the Women in Media podcast and the founder of the Women in Media Network. Yep. Now there's an entire network. I've been working really hard to get things off the ground. And what would I do without coffee? I can barely function without it. But I feel much better about putting a coffee that's full of superfoods in my body. I've been loving the Focus Fuel instant mushroom coffee from Organic Traditions. And of course, all the ingredients are organic. It's packed with lion's mane mushroom to support memory, focus, and cognitive function, adaptogens to nourish your brain, and MCT powder to boost your energy and improve mental clarity. And before you make that face, no, it doesn't taste like mushrooms. It tastes like coffee. actually better than most. There are hints of cinnamon and vanilla, and it is absolutely delicious. Did I mention it also just won Best New Mushroom Enhanced Beverage in a 2024 Brand Spark survey? Want to try the Focus Fuel mushroom coffee yourself? Head to organictraditions.com and use the promo code WomenInMedia20 for 20% off at checkout. And by the way, that applies for the entire site, not just the coffee. You're welcome. So one of the first things that you and I connected on, we were talking about just representation at festivals. And we were like, eventually we will talk about this. You'll come on the podcast. It's so funny how long it took. But, you know, all the 2024 festivals are announced. What trends are you seeing in that data? And I know that there's an account that you sort of reference as someone who's doing a lot of the work and keeping track of this specific data. If you can tell us a little more about that.
Yeah, I'm very interested in festivals. It's not something that I've analyzed, but I always try to weave in wherever I can reference to it. So I'm working on a project right now that's looking back at other studies, or I guess making reference to all those other studies that have pointed to the, you know, drastic underrepresentation of women and trans and non-binary folks on stages. The account that I follow on Instagram is called Book More Women.
Love it.
And they do this phenomenal work where they track festivals, they grab their posters, and they first, you know, build a data set to analyze representation, but they also do this really great visual art where they take the poster as is, and then they reproduce it with only the women's names. And to go from, you know, a busy full poster to 10 names is really drastic. And I love, and they always present it with the stats. So, you know, 13% women or sometimes less. And of course, including in that statistic, representation of non-binary artists, which is often 0%. So I just think this account is so important. This is, you know, for anyone who's a music lover, it's festivals and concerts and concert tours that is the public part of this for them. They're sort of, you know, we actively listen to radio, but we're almost kind of like passive consumers in it because we don't make the decisions necessarily, right? Like we're listening and it's coming at us, and you may not be thinking at the time, oh, I've had an hour and there's only been one song by a woman, because that's the way it's always been. But it's different when you go to a festival and you're like, all the headliners are men. And if there's a woman, it's like the opener to the opener to the opener. Or they're on the side stage only, or, you know, all the scenarios in which women are not offered these headlining positions. And so we really need to have these conversations because this whole industry is sort of founded around this model of like distribution and exposure. And if you're not being distributed, then you're not being picked up for tours and festivals to have the exposure to build your audience. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because then labels aren't going to sign more women, and publishers aren't going to ask their writers to be writing for women. And I say that specifically because I know this has happened in the country industry. I know that women writers were for a time encouraged to write for men. And so you get into this like really vicious cycle where what comes first, the chicken or the egg, no one can say, but we do know that one thing leads to another and that all feeds back into itself. It's like this snake eating its own head. It's really, it's really harmful.
Yeah. For a festival that's kind of close to home for you, Ottawa Blues Fest.
Yeah.
It's in your home. It's not close to home.
I could hear it from my home.
Oh, that's cool. What did you notice about that lineup specifically? And I say that because that's like, you know, a multi-day, humongous lineup. Like if let's take a look at the headliners, hey?
Yeah, let's take a look. Do that.
Blues Fest 2024.
25 years, right? 30 years this year.
30 years. Okay. So artists lineup. Well, Motley Crue. Okay. I'm trying to remember.
I'm even just trying to think of last year. We had festival passes last year and went as much as we could, but on the main stage, the biggest, I'm probably going to get this wrong and somebody's going to write me a hate letter, but it was Shania Twain, who brought the most the most audience members, I think, in history that night. It was so packed. We had to leave and like go stand at the back because we were just sardined in. But then a lot of the other women I wanted to see who were there were on the main stage, but at a time of day where the crowds are quite thin, or they were off on side stages, or they were in the War Museum on a stage inside there in their theater. So it is a very male centered festival.
If we don't talk about these things, then people just continue on. And that's what brings me to like, not so much like a wish for the industry, but like, I don't think people understand what they can do if they're kind of outside of, call it, working in the music industry. So, how can people participate in changing the systems?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think I think there are a couple of very important things. I mean, one, uh, money is tight and the economy sucks.
Yeah.
But if you can use your power to actively seek out new artists, to stream their music so they get their 0.0003 cents. I like to buy personally, but not everybody can.
Yeah.
So streaming, buying, sharing.
Mm-hmm.
Sharing is a big one, and a lot of independent artists tell me like knowing that people are sharing our work is really important, a really
Yeah.
important piece of exposure. Putting their music on your own curated playlists. I have a student who did a really great project on editorial versus fan curated playlists and the ways in which they help independent artists. And she found that, in fact, fan curated playlists play a big role in that sort of growth of a fan base for an artist. Um, the big one is going to see them, because none of these ways of engaging with music is a revenue generating. And
Yeah.
for anyone listening, they're probably thinking, why is she focusing on money? Well, the thing is, music costs money.
Of course. Yeah.
For these artists, like the financial investment to be an artist is really steep, and especially for independent artists, making, distributing, and doing all of the work required to market and brand your music costs a lot of money. And when you know that they're not making money on streaming, I saw something this morning that it's like 800,000 streams is the equivalent of like a $15 an hour job or something. Like
Oh
and
my
nobody's
gosh.
getting those kinds of streams. It's like, just, it's just awful to think that they invest so much in their art and then they don't reap any of the financial benefits of it. So going to shows is big.
Buying the ticket. Yeah.
Buying the ticket, and when you can afford it, buying the merch.
Mm-hmm.
And at some venues, I don't know if this is still the case in a post-pandemic world, but artists sometimes get a cut of the bar, so buying a drink.
Yeah.
So just being fully present and invested in whatever way you can financially do
Yeah.
goes a long way for independent artists. I want to say things like call your local station and request their music, email them,
But
most formats don't respond
yeah.
to that kind of request.
Yeah.
So absolutely try, but don't
Yeah.
be surprised if they say things like, well, it's not in my dashboard, or it wasn't serviced to us,
Well,
or,
like the one
you
guy
know,
said in the article,
yeah,
I forget the name, but if it's out there and it's found on the internet, find a WAV file, purchase it.
yes, yes. As
Like,
country program directors have said, everything is ubiquitous. Ubiquitous.
yeah,
It's on the
yeah,
internet. We can go find it.
yeah. Oh, for sure. And a lot of my programming, of course, it's easier when things arrive in your
Hmm.
inbox, but sometimes they don't, and you got to go find it. And
Yeah.
that's where it's like, I'm sorry it took you 10 minutes longer, but that's what you do if you want a song on your station.
Yeah.
It's not hard. We'll put it that way.
No. And it's an active way of being involved in the evolution of the industry.
And
What are we
maybe
just going to
that's,
sit there and passively like let things come to
yeah.
us? That's so easy.
The idea of being a music director in this current media landscape is so interesting because while your name has a director in it, dependent on the organization or the, community that they are operating within, um, the word director may mean absolutely nothing, right?
Right.
That's
Yeah,
what's interesting about
absolutely.
today. So,
Yeah.
um, I want to end our chat by asking you about some women who work in the business or, in research that have inspired you that maybe you would nominate to come on this podcast.
Ooh, that's power. Um okay. Well, actually, I don't know if she's been on, but have you had Sasha on?
No, I haven't had her yet. We talked about it.
Yeah,
We talked
she's
about it.
big on my list.
Okay.
She's really, really, really wonderful and exceptionally talented, and somebody um, who I think has a lot to contribute to this space.
Into
Not
the conversation.
necessarily this space, but to the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Shauna DeCartier.
Oh, yeah. She's been mentioned a couple times. I feel like I need to make that happen. Yeah. She's just like busy, but
Yes.
she's the best. She's the
Yeah.
best.
Yeah. Um,
Shauna DeCartier, by the way, is
yeah,
the
6-shooter.
the founder of Six Shooter Records. And in case you don't know
Yeah.
Sasha, she's a country musician.
Ooh, I feel like those are my two biggies,
Okay.
but I also, mostly I would say it would be artists like
Reese would be so amazing. Oh my God.
yeah, I mean, do they have to be Canadian? Because then I would
No,
say Reese Palmer.
please.
You would
Yes.
have so much fun with Reese.
Doesn't Reese have a podcast? I feel like Reese has a podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Color
Yeah.
Me Country Radio.
Color Me Country
Yeah.
Radio. Yeah. Definitely want to chat with Reese.
Yeah.
So this has been so fun. Thank you. I mean, it's not fun talking about how shitty the music industry is, but it's nice to talk to someone who's like actively involved in making it better. So thank you for that. Is there anything we didn't touch on that you wanted to leave listeners with?
Oh gosh. Has that been my response to every question? Oh gosh, I'm
You're
so
fine.
I'm so Canadian. Being in Nashville, folks were like, "You say oh gosh and sorry a lot." I'm like,
Sorry.
"Well,
Yeah.
yeah, get used to it." Um, no, I mean, I guess we're coming off the heels of International Women's Day. I would say, one, think intersectionally about how you make your decisions, because often when we not you
Yeah,
you
yeah.
do
Thank you.
but to anyone who's interested in this conversation, most of the time um the implicit narrative that's being promoted is advancing the careers of white women, but
Yeah.
understanding, of course, that within these models, it's women of color, it's trans women,
Yeah.
it's non-binary artists, queer women, disabled women, who are the most harmed by these systems because they were designed without them in mind. They were first and foremost designed for and by white men,
Yep.
but white women, as marginalized as they are, have the door has been a little bit open, but it's
Yeah.
closed to pretty much everybody else.
Yeah.
And so when you're thinking about the spaces that you're supporting and moving in, just try to think about who's not there, who are you not seeing, and trying to find ways to lift them up in whatever way you can, whether it's
Yeah.
sharing and streaming or
Yeah.
going to a show or
Yeah. And I'll respond personally to that. I just launched the Women in Media Network, and I am not comfortable with the fact that there are a bunch of white people. My network right now has all white creators. If you are someone, of color, from a Black community, Indigenous voice, please reach out. I do want to talk to you, and I want to hear about how I can help.
yeah.
So
Yeah, that's a big thank you for adding that, because the big piece to all of this is that media generally, these industry spaces that we work in or I work on, have been so exclusively white
Yep.
that when you don't see yourself represented, generally, you don't feel that they are spaces for you.
Yeah,
But
you
then
don't want to
add to that,
engage.
that often these spaces haven't been safe.
Yeah.
And so doing the work to ensure that what you're doing is creating a safe and secure environment for individuals to, I guess, want to trust would be the word I'd use.
Yeah.
The buy-in on that, and that takes a lot of work when we are,
Yeah.
working in a country so steeped in colonialism and white supremacy,
Yeah.
and it will take time and just continually showing that your door is open and
Yeah.
that you don't accept racist or sexist behavior.
Yeah.
It's centuries of work to undo. It's not
Yeah.
going to be overnight.
Well, I'm just happy that you're in the space and doing all that active work. I appreciate everything you post almost. I'm like, I feel like she thinks I'm liking every post right now. But no,
It's okay. I post so infrequently. It's nice.
It's great. So what you will find in the show notes today, the diversity seminar information, some published works from Jada, where you can find out more about Jada and the work that she does, and her socials, which you should follow because they're awesome. And thank you so much for coming on the Women in Media podcast.
Thanks so much. This was great.